college astronomer, Dr. Salman Hameed. This is our last bit of kitchen table astronomy for 2023 at your Amherst kitchen table. And even though time is a human construct and the universe cares not that the new year is approaching, we do. So we're going to look back on 2023 in the world of astronomy, and we're going to look at a book, and we're going to look at a movie.
That is correct. And as you have already alluded to, it's just a random point on the Earth's orbit. So it doesn't really matter. But hey, we care. And so I'm going to highlight first, let's start with astronomy. And there were a couple of interesting missions. One was the OSIRIS-REx mission that brought samples back from an asteroid. This is the first time a NASA mission brought it back to Earth. So that was actually amazing technological feat, an amazing science aspect. So that is really, and we talked about it, that we actually get meteoroids, for example, that fall from the sky. Well, I mean, you mean from the universe.
Yeah.
but as they go through our atmosphere, they get modified, they get transformed. But this
Because they burn up.
Because they burn up, and this is where this particular mission comes in, where you are getting a pristine sample. And of course, these asteroids hold clues from about the formation of our solar system, probably sort of about organic compounds from which life arose, and so on and so forth. So it's actually really interesting. The other one, of course, from the South Asia connection, was the big successful landing of the Chandrayaan-3 from Indian spacecraft on near the south pole of the moon. That was an amazing development. And so those were the space missions. And of course, James Webb Space Telescope keeps on giving us great stuff. And apart from spectacular pictures, and you can just go through the James Webb Telescope site and you can see all of those amazing things. I think the thing to highlight would be, and we have talked a couple of times, and that was about a lot of exoplanet atmospheres. And so exoplanets are the planets that are orbiting other stars. One of the big missions of James Webb Space Telescope is to potentially look for signatures of life. We don't know if we will find those indirectly, just looking through the telescope. But right now, in terms of the demonstration of technology, we are getting closer because it has detected various molecules in the atmospheres of exoplanets. I mean, this is hard because, again, we've talked about it even 30 years ago, we did not know even the existence of exoplanets.
We theorized that they must exist, but we couldn't observe them and prove here is an exoplanet until the 90s.
Because it's very hard. You have a small planet right next to a really bright star, and so it is difficult. So to come in 30 years to the point where we can actually start detecting what is in the atmospheres of these exoplanets, that is already a huge advancement. And there has been a detection of methane, carbon dioxide, and so on and so forth. So that just shows that, well, with time, maybe James Webb Space Telescope, just maybe, detect something that are of maybe molecular oxygen, maybe something else, maybe indirect signatures of life. But we don't have it yet. But the technology is getting there. So that is exciting. However, what I thought I'm going to highlight for astronomy news is something that is a problem, and it was a dud, and that is how we sensationalize astronomy news. And I think mid-year, Monte, we talked about this big news, that James Webb Space Telescope has found galaxies early in the universe that should not exist. And in fact, the headline was these are impossible galaxies. Mm-hmm. The authors themselves said, we broke the universe. And that led to various kinds of headlines that James Webb Space Telescope disproves Big Bang, or it just breaks sort of all of cosmology, so on and so forth. And we talked about it at that time as well, that there is a problem with these kind of headlines, because when you have a new instrument, when you have these kind of results, it's not that, oh my goodness, look, these are impossible. Rather, hey, this is really interesting. Let's figure out why this might be the case. Mm-hmm. And even then, there were alternative explanations. So let me just set it up. The issue was that the Big Bang, which we think the universe started around 13.8 billion years ago, so a long time back. And we have very good evidence that it did start. I mean, and there are all other things like, that how big the universe is and things like that. Those are other things. But 13.8 billion years ago, our universe started expanding, if you think about it that way. And it was very simple elements right in the beginning, hydrogen and helium, and then most of the other elements formed inside stars, and so on and so forth. So it takes some time to form the first galaxies. The question is, how long? And when James Webb Space Telescope is specifically designed, one of its big goals is to look for the earliest galaxies, maybe even the first stars, but certainly the earliest galaxies. So the results came out that it is detecting galaxies couple of hundred million years after the Big Bang.
And the theory was that they shouldn't be able to have formed that early.
That big. Right? I mean, you would expect that the first galaxies would be much smaller in size, and then it takes some time for galaxies to have more stars, develop more stars, and to become bigger. So that was the big news story that, well, it is detecting really massive galaxies. Like, there are a lot of stars in those galaxies, and only a few 100 million years after the Big Bang. So that was really surprising. The problem was, and a lot of the people were pointing that out, and we also talked about it here, that yes, you have an observation and you look through light. That's what we are getting. I mean, astronomers, all of our currency is light. The question is, how do we interpret those results? And in this particular case, people had said, well, the earlier galaxies can be unusual in terms of the way the light is produced, because you have to assume what you see from light, and you assume that how many stars are producing that light. And we use that assumption, so that's where the assumption part comes in, from our own Milky Way galaxy or nearby galaxies. But nearby galaxies are basically 13 billion years after the Big Bang. So can they be different than the first galaxies? And so that was, a lot of people were saying like, yeah, these are unusual. This is a fantastic discovery. But it doesn't mean that the Big Bang model is wrong, or it doesn't mean that these galaxies are impossible. Before we get to those points, we may just be, the earliest stars may be a little bit different the way they're producing light. And now it's coming out that indeed, and again, this is a technical term, but I'll use it because it's fun. It's called IMF, and it's not the International Monetary Fund, which is also a cause of a lot of problems in the world. But this is the initial mass function, meaning to say, you see light, and then you assume that what is the distribution of stars, how many big stars and how many small stars are producing that light. So this is the mass function, how the stars formed. And we assume, because it's really easy to, or not easy, but certainly it's much more accurate to measure nearby galaxies than far, far away. And so the models that were used for the farthest galaxies, the earliest galaxies in the universe, we were using the models for the nearby universe. And some people had suggested that, well, early in the universe, that may be different. You may be producing far more bigger stars than smaller stars, and that may explain this discrepancy. And sure enough, now we are getting to the point. Now there are other papers coming out that are saying models showing that, yeah, actually, I think if you change that, that can actually resolve this discrepancy, and you have these galaxies, but that are not as massive, but they're very bright.
So don't jump to conclusions and say the universe is broken or this or that. The Big Bang is not true. That's really on us, the media, for sensationalizing this so frequently.
Yeah, and and that's the point that I want to make, and that is that we are getting to the point where everything is about grabbing attention. So we talk about attention economy, and so you have a TikTok or you have whatever, hey, we can actually make news here as well, if it's something sensational about UFOs and things like that. But that is a problem because scientists themselves, like in that particular case, the scientists themselves made those headlines. You and I have been contacted sometimes about news stories from universities. They say, hey, this is a really big story coming out, and the scientist is available to talk about that. Mm-hmm. But actually, you look at it like, no, it's an interesting story, but it's not the biggest story. So there is this element of, I would almost say the corporatization of science and science stories, because there is a system now on how to get to the news, how to have a template that makes it, this is the biggest story that you've heard. Mm-hmm. And here you have the astronomers themselves, or scientists, I'm not just picking on astronomers, or scientists, they are available for comment as well.
Yeah.
And so you have this feedback thing, and that's the reason I want to pick on this particular story, because we don't talk about, hey, what was the biggest story? No, those galaxies didn't break the universe. The Big Bang was not disproven, whatever that means, by these galaxies. So I want to highlight at the end of the year that no, this was the biggest story, but actually people thought it was the biggest story, but it's not, and there is a problem with that. And the same problem goes with claims about UFOs as well. Avi Loeb claimed, like, the Harvard astronomer,
yeah.
like, that from under the ocean he found some alien sort of like, technology spherules. It turns out those were industrial pollutants, but he's really good at getting publicity, and he has explicitly said publicity is good because it gets money. That is a problem, right? I mean, like, there is plenty of amazing science. I mean, the fact that we can talk about 13.5 billion years ago, sort of like, we have galaxies, we can talk about these phenomenal first galaxies or exoplanets and so many things. We don't need to sensationalize, but because of the nature of news cycles, this is becoming, and I am really concerned about it, that as time is going on, we are going to see more and more of these sensational stories, and people will have a harder time to assess which is a real story and which is just sensational. And you go like, scientists don't know. Big Bang, who knows? One day they say this, one day they say the other. Same thing like with evolution that has happened. Sort of like, evolution, who knows? Like, people don't know. So I think as scientists, we have to be careful about how we assess things, and there is beauty in it.
Well, that ties into Merriam-Webster, our dictionary in Springfield, and our other regular guest's word of the year, which is authentic. People looked up authentic this year over last year much more because they're looking for what's true. One of the runners-up for word of the year was Doppelganger, and that brings us to the book portion of your year in review here, the Naomi Klein book, Doppelganger, which is one of the reasons why that word spiked in lookups for Merriam-Webster.
I absolutely loved this book. And actually, this is not disconnected from just a conversation we were having, because I think, so Doppelganger, for people who don't know, that's a book by Naomi Klein, and she wrote about, because she was often mistaken for another Naomi Wolf, who used to be a liberal, but then she became conservative and vaccine denier and so on and so forth. This is a fantastic book, which it's much deeper. And initially, when I read a little bit about that, I was like, this just looks like a gimmick. Mm-hmm. How is it going to be interesting? But actually, it's a deeper analysis of our culture today. And she also talks about things like, it explains conspiracy theories, for example, like, that there are people who used to be, that's where Naomi Wolf also comes in, who would be critical, who would be on the left in some sense, but then they flipped. The question is why? And that's where the doppelganger part comes in, that they are similar but a bit different. Mm-hmm. So Naomi Klein actually goes a bit deeper into that, and she thinks that in some ways our whole society has also, within the American context, and I think it applies to a certain degree globally as well, but she's talking about the American context, they've become a doppelganger of itself. Mm-hmm. And there are similar elements, but not the same. And that goes with, of course, COVID did not help. A lot of it, her book is focused on COVID. But what I really appreciated was the connection, when I was reading it, to a lot of the UFO stuff as well. And we were just talking about the attention economy. Mm-hmm. And Naomi Klein, and I want to be careful I don't confuse her with Naomi Wolf as well. Naomi Klein talks about, like her previous books was about shock doctrine, or like, how this disaster capitalism comes in, or she calls it sort of like capitalizable conspiracies, meaning to say that you have this anti-vaccine stuff, but by using anti-vaccine stuff, you can be on TikTok, you can be on YouTube, you can have
run for president.
Or you can run for president. So what her point is that there is this attention-grabbing aspect, and these conspiracies have become capitalizable. Mm-hmm. And that connects to the UFO stuff that I was talking about, because indeed, the whole UAP stuff which you get sort of like, congressional hearings about it. Of course, nothing has happened. Even last Sunday, Ross Douthat, who's, I hope I'm pronouncing his
I
name.
never know how to say that guy's name. Douthat? I don't know.
But,
he's the more conservative voice in the opinion pages of the Sunday Times.
And he's a thoughtful guy. I mean, like, he's
I think
one of
so
those,
too, yeah.
and I would disagree with him 80% of the time, but I think you can have a good, interesting conversation with
Absolutely.
him. Unlike Brett Stevens, I think. But anyway, so his thing was like, either put up or shut up. And he was talking about the UFO sort of like, claims about it, because now it shows up in the Senate hearings.
Right.
It showed up in the congressional hearings.
The Senate's mad at the House for not allowing this information to be revealed. But.
And so I'm deeply skeptical about it. We have talked about it, because if that was the case, the world would be very different than it is now. But so and so forth. There are a lot of other reasons, and the lack of curiosity for people who are making claims. But this is where Doppelganger, the book, talks about that our culture right now, because it's so embedded in the attention aspects, that these conspiracies themselves, actually, they make a lot of money. And what Avi Loeb, for example, the Harvard astronomer, has been saying is saying exactly those things. Now, I'm not saying that they are deliberately lying about it, but I'm saying that, well, of course, and so did anti-vaxxers either. Oftentimes they're not deliberately lying, but they believe some aspect of it. So what I really liked, and I want to get to one point about that, and that is that she talks about that sometimes, there is an element of truth. What, for example, anti-COVID people were saying. And of course, vaccines work, but there was an element about skepticism, for example, to the pharmaceutical companies. And what she was saying, an interesting point, I think, is about the fact that when the left, and I'm going to use or people who believed in the vaccines work and things like that, when they went like, no, vaccines work, they also became less critical of the problems of pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And whereas the people who were denying that vaccines work or vaccines are a conspiracy and things like that, they were actually critical of pharmaceutical companies, which everyone ought to be.
I know. It's like weird when the vaccine's out there and everything on TV is sponsored by Pfizer all of a sudden. I was like, this doesn't feel good.
Not to mention that these companies, which were heavily subsidized by the government here and other governments as well, and those vaccines were not made easily available for the developing world.
Right.
And so that's a clear, and they made a ton of profit. So I think so what she talks about are these things where she says that conspiracy theorists get the facts wrong, but they often get the feeling right. And that is the appeal of these conspiracy theories, or why people would feel that, because they go like, I get it, there is something that is to it. And oftentimes, again, she's talking from the left, that oftentimes we abandon that whole ground of criticism, which we should not. So I think that is there. And also for the current moment in time, this book came out, I think, early October or late September, but she has a fantastic chapter on Palestine. The last chapter of the book it is. I don't want to talk about it because then we will get into that conversation, but that's a fantastic analysis of, again, within the context of Doppelganger, because she also talks about Zionism, Israel, and all of those things within that context. So please check it out, Doppelganger by Naomi Klein.
And you also have one movie to wrap up our year in the world of kitchen table astronomy, which we've talked a lot about, books and movies. We've gone to the movies this past year. You're on the board of Amherst Cinema. Mr. Universe there, Dr. Salman Hameed. What's the movie you want to talk about?
I would have picked, in theory, from the science perspective, Oppenheimer, but I did not. I think I want to highlight a movie called Past Lives. It's a small indie film. It's getting a lot of buzz for the award season, which I'm so happy about. It's written and directed by Celine Song, and it stars Greta Lee in it, and it's a Korean American film. If you want to think about that, although it's it's set mostly in the U.S. in New York City. And what I liked about this film is about this girl who was in Seoul in Korea, and when she was 12 years old, her parents immigrated to the U.S., and she had a best friend at that time over there, And then many years later, she reconnects with her friend when she's in New York as a playwright, and they reconnect in some sense, like, sort of like, through online and things like that. I'm an immigrant. I came to the US when I was 18, and I've been here since then. And to me, this movie gets to this heart of the immigrant experience. And this is hard to describe. I mean, this is one of those few movies. I mean, oftentimes these immigrant experiences are, oh my goodness, it's terrible, or there's a culture clash and things like that. This movie actually is more subtle in there. And I'm not saying that those movies are not great. I mean, those movies are also fantastic. But this is a movie this is just at a very normal, without all of those exaggerated clashes that happen actually. What does happen to your life? And it happens to everybody when people move from any place. People also change from one age as they grow up. But as somebody moving from completely one culture to a completely different culture, there is almost a break that happens. Like, you leave your whole persona, your whole life, your whole culture in a different place, and then you start at another place. So what happens to your past life? I mean, and I'm not using the past life in the sense the movie uses it, but I'm just saying, and although there is an allusion to that, you have that as well. But you have a new life also, and you become part of a mixture of both. And I think, so one way to think about that, you can also become very nostalgic. You lose a lot. And so a lot of my friends actually feel like that, like, oh my goodness, like, oh, that was the best time when we were in high school in Pakistan and things like that. I actually don't think like that. I actually do think that, but you also learn so much. You also become a completely new person, which you would not have had you lived there, right? And so what is your new life? The combination, because that you bring all of the other cultural context to this new setting, and you become a very different new person. And so how do you think about this loss and gain? And I think this movie grapples with that. It's a love story to New York City as well. It's an homage to a lot of the classic New York films, When Harry Met Sally, or Woody Allen films and things like that. So this is set in New York City and Seoul, but a lot of it in New York City. But to me, the best part of that is it's just this subtle way of really grappling with the things that you lose and the things that you gain by moving from one context to another, and the value of both. And perhaps you can argue it's a loss because you do lose something, or you can argue that it's a gain because you do gain something, or something in between. It is about that. So it's a really beautiful immigrant experience story and how we make sense of life. And it's about life because, yeah, immigrants also have life. So, yeah, it's about life.
And what a perfect movie to transition from one year that you leave behind to a new year that's filled with hopes and dreams and a chance to restart. I think 2024, to get sensationalist about it, the year we're going to prove that aliens exist.
Well, it depends upon the election.